Hi everyone, this is Andy Hira from Simon Fraser University. I want to speak to you about the Geopolitics of Energy. This lecture is part of the Energy Politics course that's offered at Simon Fraser University. Our agenda for today is to think about the historical background of the petroleum economy and how fundamentally important it is to the rise of Western economies and to our quality of life that increased and improved so much throughout the 20th century. I also want to talk to you about the ways that it revolutionized the way our modern economies, everything from transportation to food storage, and in fact set the table for a global economy to start to take effect. We'll also talk about some of the problems that came along with that transformation, including the rise of the Middle East as a center of geopolitics, and we'll reinforce that by examining some of the statistics around the key suppliers, the key sources of emissions for greenhouse gases, and where a lot of the fossil fuels are consumed now in our economies. And then finally, we'll finish up with a particular topic of interest for those who are concerned about global development, and that is the resource curse that often afflicts large suppliers of commodity products, including fossil fuels. So let's think about the petroleum economy for a moment and how important it has been to the rise of Western economies. In the 19th century, even once railways were built, it would take at least 4 days to go from Toronto to Vancouver by rail. And what you see in this old photograph is, in fact, ports were the most vital linkage. Can you imagine if you were trying to get from Eastern Canada to Vancouver? You would have to go through the Straits of Magellan all the way around South America. It would take you weeks to make that kind of trip. The railways started to revolutionize things, but it's really petroleum that revolutionized and changed the costs and our ability to expand our economies and thereby to increase our standard of living. And simple example of that is thinking about, in homes, wood fires were the main sources of heating or for light. And at the end of the 19th century, you probably have heard about the famous novel Moby Dick. Well, it's about the fact that whale oil was often used for lighting in houses. Whale oil was finally supplanted by electricity, as was heat. Think about your food preservation there and how difficult it would have been. Many cases, families would have to rely on their own sustenance in terms of agriculture or hunting to manage in a frontier area like British Columbia at that time. Now we can just import our food through large tankers fueled by diesel fuel, and we can use our natural gas generators or hydro generators to create electricity and use refrigeration. Things have completely turned around with the dawning of the petroleum age. So what did the petroleum revolution entail? Well, it entailed wholesale transformation of our Western economies. The ability to generate electricity en masse and to spread it throughout our territories. The ability to have cheaper and safer heat, including electricity-based heat, as well as natural gas, which is still very predominant in many households throughout North America. Perhaps most importantly, completely transformed our transportation sectors. We're talking about not only the dawn of automobiles, but a lot of our shipping occurs through trucks, through large freight ships, and through containers. And obviously, our ability to travel from one continent to another depends on the airplanes, and airplanes all depend upon petroleum. Beyond that, we have a number of side products that come from petroleum that transform our quality of life. The petrochemical industry, plastics, pharmaceuticals. We could go on and on with how many products are derived from petroleum that are vital to our everyday lives. Most importantly, it really reduced the overall cost of energy so that it made things much easier, faster, and cheaper, and therefore was the most important boost, perhaps, to economic growth during the 20th century and the development of a middle class. How important was oil? Think about the fact that a lot of wars, including those occurring today, depend heavily upon access to petroleum. Hitler's defeat in World War II was based in good part on him spreading himself thin because he was trying to capture the oil fields in the Caucasus and southern Russia. It was so vital that his inability to access oil actually had a major effect on the turning of that war. And the development of modern warfare went hand in hand with the Middle East becoming the center of geopolitics for much of the 20th century. You can see from this map that I have brought up here how important those small straits of Hormuz, of Malacca, are to the vital shipment of oil across the world. So much of the oil in East Asia, which is almost 100% dependent on imports. So much of the oil and gas in Europe, which is almost 100% dependent upon imports, especially for its transportation sector, goes through very narrow corridors of waterways, including the Suez Canal. And so that's why the Middle East has become such a centerpiece of geopolitical intrigue. If we think about and take a look now at who is producing this oil, what we see in this graph here is that the U.S., especially from the fracking revolution, it has really taken off and it's become the leading petroleum producer in the world. Now, remember, a lot of that oil is consumed within the U.S. itself, so it's not exporting all of it, but it has become a significant exporter. And Saudi Arabia, the importance of Saudi Arabia to OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, is underscored here. And Saudi Arabia and Russia then are the most influential oil exporters. Canada is within a pack of other medium-sized exporters. You can see the percentages on the left. 31% of oil is produced in the Middle East. Of course, a lot more of the exports are coming from there. Saudi Arabia alone is responsible for 11%, Russia for 11%, and Canada 6%. Now, China is another large producer, but obviously consumes almost all that it produces. In natural gas, a relatively new fossil fuel product, we only have two double-digit producers. That is the U.S. that produces 25% of the natural gas that is now exporting in liquefied form to Europe and to Asia, and Russia with 15% of production, much of which is exported to China. This chart from the IEA shows the incredible importance of the Middle East again for oil movements. As I mentioned before, East Asia and Europe rely heavily upon oil and gas. And we can see that this map is somewhat dated because it still shows a lot of oil moving and gas moving from Russia to Europe. And in fact, now with the Ukraine war, some of that has dried up. So these other flows of oil have become even more important. Now that brings us to the question about CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions are obviously the most important component of greenhouse gases and therefore the most important cause of climate change. And what you can see is unmistakable in this chart. That is, most of the emissions are concentrated in the large Western economies in Japan, but that they have declined relatively recently in the last couple of decades. And so the real story is this rocket growth of emissions in China and in India. And so we also have large amounts of growth, albeit at smaller amounts, among the larger oil producers. So these are the largest emitters by country of CO2. And what we can see is it is very much what we would call a club problem. That is, if you can get this club of these three largest economies to work together to reduce emissions, you could go a long way towards solving climate change. That, in turn, obviously depends on the factors that we just talked about, which is how can we transform our economies away from this incredible dependence on fossil fuels. Now let's look at who actually consumes fossil fuels in our economies, and I'm going to focus here on Canada. Primary energy consumption in terms of global consumption shows us the same pattern that we saw in our last graph, which is this incredible rocket growth of oil consumption, of energy consumption by China. The US and the EU have kind of plateaued. They haven't really declined to a major degree, certainly not to the degree that would be helpful for climate change. And you can also see this energy consumption of Russia that increases along with its emergence as a major oil exporter. India is another one to keep your eye on. India, as its economic growth has improved, is also consuming much more energy than it had previously. So here again, what we see is that there's a real concentration in energy consumption among the different countries of the world. And it reinforces what we just discussed, which is these fast-growing countries of China and India are the ones that are probably going to be the biggest danger zone for climate change. When you look at this red bar here, this represents coal, and we can see in particular how much China and India rely on coal, whereas coal has been started to be phased out in much of Europe and North America because natural gas is much cheaper. That may happen in East Asia, it may happen in India eventually, but right now, coal, which is far dirtier fuel, is heavily relied upon in these fast-growing economies. So what about Canada? We are really blessed with clean energy resources in Canada. In fact, 60% of our energy resources are based in hydro. Those are concentrated in Quebec, in Manitoba, and primarily in BC. But unfortunately, we don't have easy means of trading that electricity across borders. So what you also see is Ontario relies on uranium for nuclear energy for much of its generation, much more expensive and completely unnecessary. And some of Ontario and some of the prairie provinces like Alberta also rely on natural gas. Again, unnecessary when we have so many hydro resources. We also see that wind has a very small, relatively small share, one that we hope will grow over time because it is now very competitive, and solar is less than 1%. So solar really has such a small footprint within Canada, and it's not for a lack of solar resources. They are abundant in Ontario and the prairies. They just haven't been developed. What about where is the energy used? So if we look at it by sector, what we see is that almost half of it, just about over half of it, is used in heavy industry. That would be one of the first things to really focus on, and that tends to be a very sticky problem, very challenging to reduce the amount of fossil fuel components that you have in cement, for example, or in auto manufacturing, because of the amount of energy that's required. Transportation is the next big target, and here obviously, we have had a long-standing policy to phase out gas cars and move towards electric vehicles, but it's one that's still fraught. As you know, in the US, it has been reversed, and we'll see. Hopefully, it will hold on in Canada because that will really transform things, but it will also vastly increase our demand for electricity. We can also see in terms of fuel sources how important petroleum and natural gas are within this mix. If you could start to transform the transportation sector, you would really make a dent in terms of Canada's climate change emissions, which have largely been flat for several years. You can see here in this graph the emissions by sector, and what we can see very plainly is that the oil and gas emissions continue to be very large, approximately 30% of our emissions. And that's because we're producing so much oil and gas. And when you produce oil and gas, that obviously leads to emissions en route, including natural gas, methane emissions, which are very harmful for the environment and not reflected here because we're looking at CO2. Transportation is also a huge dent. But we also notice from this graph that every sector is involved with emissions. And so this is something we really need to pay attention to. The climate change problem is a problem of the entire economy, not just the oil and gas economy and not just vehicles. I want to turn now to our last subject to briefly describe some of the issues that oil producers and commodities producers in general tend to have. It's called the resource curse. And Canada, to some extent, fits within this as a large oil and gas producer, as well as a large producer of agriculture. The resource curse is viewed as a way to try to explain why these large, very gifted producers of oil and gas seem to struggle with corruption. They seem to struggle with economic diversification. They struggle with changing their economy. And the resource curse is a rich body of literature that tries to explain that. It's also called the paradox of plenty, and it's been applied to a variety of commodities beyond just oil and gas. This could include economies, for example, that rely primarily on exports of agricultural crops like coffee, or exporters of minerals such as copper. And what happens is what economists call the Dutch disease. That is, once you start relying on commodity exports, we know that there is a roller coaster ride of prices that happens. The Dutch disease basically means that as your prices for your petroleum exports go up, it will start to overvalue your currency. That means that your imports will become cheaper and your exports will become more expensive. This has an effect of crowding out other sectors. For example, Venezuela used to be a strong agricultural producer, but when the price of petroleum increased so much, it increased overall inflation in the economy, and it changed the exchange rate to where agricultural exports were no longer possible and agricultural imports were cheaper. It also lends itself to what we call pro-cyclicality. That is a term that suggests that when the oil money is coming in good, we should be saving, but instead oil exporters tend to spend even more. And when the oil prices are low, they continue spending. So this leads to all kinds of government debt problems. And it lends itself to the term that we call petrostate or rentier state. That is, it is relying on the rents, the money that it makes from one particular commodity. And this also reflects upon the discount rate. That is, how much we consider short-term gains versus long-term gains. In petroleum economies, because of the volatility of the price, that volatility tends to be reflected in a volatility in politics in terms of a zero-sum approach to try to capture the rents from that particular commodity. In fact, what we've seen if we look at prices over time is that not only are commodities on a roller coaster, but as agricultural prices tend to go up, just lends itself to more supplies. As oil prices go up, over the longer term, it lends itself to offshore oil or to fracking. And so it's very difficult for a commodity producer to get ahead unless they can diversify. So some countries have tried to do that by, for example, for Chile, by instilling fiscal rules, that is, forcing saving when prices of copper are high, or in the case of Norway, by creating a sovereign wealth fund. Some of the Gulf states do this as well, that would invest in diversification and assets around the world so that all of the resources of a country don't just depend on the price of that one commodity. Those are difficult things to do. It depends on a very capable and disciplined government, and that often doesn't happen. In the case of Venezuela, for example, the average exports compared to the size of their economy were almost a third. And oil is 95% of their exports. Yet a third of their population still lives below the poverty line. They are one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And you can also see this incredible volatility of their economic growth, which in turn reflects the issues we talked about in terms of the resource curse and commodity price cycles. So is it really true? In general, it does seem to be true that large oil producers tend to be more corrupt. When you look at the ones that are lowest in terms of the corruption perception index, they tend to be oil producers. There are some exceptions, such as Canada and Norway. These are economies that are more diversified, including the U.S., and also that came into the system of oil exporting much later than these other producers. Their economy isn't wholly dependent, but it is dependent to some degree on oil exports. Canada in particular relies very heavily in Alberta and in the federal government upon oil revenues for part of its government budget. So what we see then in general is that these resource-rich economies, these large oil exporters, oftentimes have weak domestic economies. They rely on imports of immigration at times. They have ongoing conflict over control of those resources. They often have a military that acts as an arbiter of those domestic conflicts. Um, and so as the prices become volatile and as outside forces seek to control those resources, it lends itself to a very volatile and tumultuous geopolitical situation. There are also inherent aspects of industry that lend themselves to this resource curse. If we think about mining in general, it tends to be very highly capital and technology intensive. It requires billions of dollars and high levels of risk to undertake. Mining is a global enterprise and requires global markets, so therefore it lends itself to outside interference through MNCs, or even in the case where you have nationalized oil companies, to reliance on retail markets in the West as their end customers. And because it's highly capital and technology intensive, it doesn't create a lot of jobs. It creates steady revenues when oil prices are high, but then they can disappear in a flash. And so all of that means that these tend to lend themselves to very large companies rather than spreading the wealth across the economy and across sectors. So what we've talked about in this lecture is the fact that petroleum has been central to geopolitics throughout the 20th century. It tends to create winners and losers on both domestic and global levels. And reducing emissions is difficult because our economies are so intertwined with carbon, and political entities, political governments are so reliant on petroleum revenues, now becoming natural gas revenues. So the question I want to leave you with to ponder is, will a transition to clean energy, to renewable energy, to electric vehicles, how will that change the politics? That is something worth considering and discussing. And obviously, along with that is the question about whether carbon lock-in is one of the key obstacles in preventing us from making that clean energy transition. So thanks for your time, and I look forward to further discussions about this.